When Police Chief Miles Underbeck saw Old Man Gauss coming into headquarters in Clinton Center, he sat back and sighed heavily. He was busy this morning, and undoubtedly Old Man Gauss was coming in to inquire about that infernal cow of his that had wandered off. The old eccentric had a new and startling report, however. He claimed that Rupert Barnaby was missing. He'd gone into the swamp the night before, Gauss insisted, and had not returned. When Chief Underbeck questioned him closely, Gauss admitted that he wasn't positive Barnaby hadn't returned. It was barely possible that he had returned home very early in the morning and then left again before Gauss arrived. But Gauss fixed his flashing eyes on the chief and shook his head. He never came out, I tell ye. That dog of his nose howled, he did, like a dog howls for the dead. Whatever come took sorry, got Barnaby in the swamp last night. Chief Underbeck was not an excitable man. Gauss's bursts of melodrama irritated him and left him unimpressed. Somewhat gruffly, he promised to look into the matter if Barnaby had not turned up by evening. Barnaby, he pointed out, knew the swamp better than anyone else in the county, and he was perfectly capable of taking care of himself. Probably, the chief suggested, he had sent the dog home and gone elsewhere after finishing his hunt the evening before. The chances were he'd be back by supper time. Old Man Gauss shook his head with a kind of fatalistic skepticism. Vouching that events would soon prove his fears well-founded, he shambled grouchily out of the station. The day passed, and there was no sign of Rupert Barnaby. At 6 o'clock, Old Man Gauss grimly marched into the Crown, Clinton Center's second-rung hotel, and registered for a room. At 7 o'clock, Chief Underbeck dispatched a prowl car to Barnaby's place. He waited impatiently for its return, drumming on the desk. Disinterestedly, shuffling through a sheaf of reports which had accumulated during the day. The prowl car returned shortly before 8. Sergeant Grimes made his report. Nobody there, sir. Place locked up tight. Searched the grounds. All we saw was Barnaby's dog. Howled and ran off as if the devil were on his tail. Chief Underbeck was troubled. If Barnaby was missing, a search should be started at once. But it was already getting dark, and portions of Wharton's swamp were very nearly impassable during the day. Besides, there was no proof that Barnaby had not gone off for a visit, perhaps to nearby Stantonville, for instance, to call on a crony and stay overnight. By 9 o'clock, he had decided to postpone any action till morning. A search now would probably be futile in any case. The swamp offered too many obstacles. If Barnaby had not turned up by morning, and there was no report that he had been seen elsewhere, a systematic search of the marsh could begin. Not long after he had arrived at this decision, and as he was somewhat wearily preparing to leave headquarters and go home, a new and genuinely alarming interruption took place. Shortly before 9:30, a car braked to a sudden stop outside headquarters. An elderly man hurried in, supporting by the arm a sobbing, hysterical young girl. Her skirt and stockings were torn, and there were a number of scratches on her face. After assisting her to a chair, the man turned to Chief Underbeck and the other officers who gathered around. Picked her up on the highway out near Wharton Swamp, screaming at the top of her lungs. He wiped his forehead. She ran right in front of my car. Missed her by a miracle. She was so crazy with fear, I couldn't make sense out of what she said. Seems like something grabbed her boyfriend in the bushes out there. Anyway, I got her in the car without much trouble, and I guess I broke a speed law getting here. Chief Underbeck surveyed the man keenly. He was obviously shaken himself, and since he did not appear to be concealing anything, the chief turned to the girl. He spoke soothingly, doing his best to reassure her, and at length she composed herself sufficiently to tell her story. Her name was Dolores Rell, and she lived in nearby Stantonville. Earlier in the evening, she had gone riding with her fiancé, Jason Buckmist of Clinton Center. As Jason was driving along the highway adjacent to Wharton Swamp, she had remarked that the early evening moonlight looked very romantic over the marsh. Jason had stopped the car, and after they had surveyed the scene for some minutes, he suggested that since the evening was warm, a brief stroll in the moonlight might be fun. Dolores had been reluctant to leave the car, but at length had been persuaded to take a short walk along the edge of the marsh where the terrain was relatively firm. As the couple were walking along the trees, perhaps 20 yards or so from the car, Dolores became aware of an unpleasant odor and wanted to turn back. Jason, however, told her she had only imagined it and insisted on going farther. As the trees grew closer together, they walked Indian file, Jason taking the lead. Suddenly, she said, they both heard something swishing through the brush toward them. Jason told her not to be frightened, that it was probably someone's cow. As it came closer, however, it seemed to be moving with incredible speed, and it didn't seem to be making the kind of noise a cow would make. At the last second, Jason whirled with a cry of fear and told her to run. Before she could move, she saw a monstrous something rushing under the trees in the dim moonlight. For an instant, she stood rooted with horror. Then she turned and ran. She thought she heard Jason running behind her. She couldn't be sure, but immediately after, she heard him scream. In spite of her terror, she turned and looked behind her. At this point in her story, she became hysterical again, and several minutes passed before she could go on. She could not describe exactly what she had seen as she looked over her shoulder. The thing, which she had glimpsed rushing under the trees, had caught up with Jason. It almost completely covered him. All she could see of him was his agonized face and part of one arm, low near the ground, as if the thing were squatting astride him. She could not say what it was. It was black, formless, bestial and not bestial, It was the dark, gliding kind of indescribable horror which she had shuddered at when she was a little girl alone in the nursery at night. She shuddered now and covered her eyes as she tried to picture what she had seen. "Oh God, the darkness come alive! The darkness come alive!" Somehow, she went on presently, she had stumbled through the trees into the road. She was so terrified that she hardly noticed the approaching car. There could be no doubt that Dolores Rell was in the grip of genuine terror. Chief Underback acted with alacrity. After the white-faced girl had been driven to a nearby hospital for treatment of her scratches and the administration of a sedative, Underback rounded up all available men on the force, equipped them with shotguns, rifles, and flashlights, hurried them into 4 prowl cars, and started off for Wharton Swamp. Jason Buckmeister's car was found where he had parked it. It had not been disturbed. A search of the nearby swamp area, conducted in the glare of flashlights, proved fruitless. Whatever had attacked Buckmeister had apparently carried him off into the farthest recesses of the sprawling swamp. After 2 futile hours of bush breaking and marsh sloshing, Chief Underback wearily rounded up his men and called off the hunt until morning. As the first streaks of dawn appeared in the sky over Wharton Swamp, the search began again. Reinforcements, including civilian volunteers from Clinton Center, had arrived, and a systematic combing of the entire swamp commenced. By noon, the search had proved fruitless, or nearly so. One of the searchers brought in a battered hat and a rye whiskey bottle, which he had discovered on the edge of the marsh under a sweet gum tree. The shapeless felt hat was old and worn, but it was dry. It had therefore apparently been discarded in the swamp since the storm of a few days ago. The whiskey bottle looked new. In fact, a few drops of rye remained in it. The searcher reported that the remains of a small campfire were also found under the sweet gum. In the hope that this evidence might have some bearing on the disappearance of Jason Buckmeister, Chief Underback ordered a canvass of every liquor store in Clinton Center in an attempt to learn the names of everyone who had recently purchased a bottle of the particular brand of rye found under the tree. The search went on, and mid-afternoon brought another, more ominous discovery. A diligent searcher, investigating a trampled area in a large growth of cattails, picked a rifle out of the mud. After the slime and dirt had been wiped away, 2 of the searchers vouched that it belonged to Rupert Barnaby. One of them had hunted with him and remembered a bit of scroll work on the rifle stock. While Chief Underback was weighing this unpalatable bit of evidence, a report of the liquor store canvass in Clinton Center arrived. Every recent purchaser of a quart bottle of the particular brand in question had been investigated. Only one could not be located: a tramp who had hung around the town for several days and had been ordered out. By evening, most of the exhausted searching party were convinced that the tramp probably in a state of homicidal viciousness brought on by drink, had murdered both Rupert Barnaby and Jason and secreted their bodies in one of the deep pools of the swamp. The chances were the murderer was still sleeping off the effects of drink somewhere in the tangled thickets of the marsh. Most of the searchers regarded Dolores Rell's melodramatic story with a great deal of skepticism. In the dim moonlight, they pointed out, a frenzied, wild-eyed tramp bent on imminent murder might have very well resembled some kind of monster. And the girl's hysteria had probably magnified what she had seen. As night closed over the dismal morass, Chief Underbeck reluctantly suspended the hunt. In view of the fact that the murderer probably still lurked in the woods, however, he decided to establish a system of night-long patrols along the highway, which paralleled the swamp. If the quarry lay hidden in the treacherous tangle of trees and brush, he would not be able to escape onto the highway without running into one of the patrols. The only other means of egress from the swamp lay miles across the mire where the open sea washed against a reedy beach, and it was quite unlikely that the fugitive would even attempt escape in that direction. The patrols were established in 3-hour shifts, 2 men to a patrol, both heavily armed and both equipped with powerful searchlights. They were ordered to investigate every sound or movement which they detected in the brush bordering the highway. After a single command to halt, they were to shoot to kill. Any curious motorists who stopped to inquire about the hunt were to be swiftly waved on their way, after being warned not to give rides to anyone and to report all hitchhikers.